I was 24 when I moved into my first apartment alone. It was in a small college town in upstate New York, about 10 minutes from campus. Not student housing, just an old brick building tucked behind a pharmacy and a laundromat. 3 floors, narrow hallways, heavy fire doors that always closed too hard. My unit was on the 3rd floor at the very end. 1 bedroom, old hardwood floors, radiator heat. The windows looked out over the parking lot and the back of a grocery store. At night, I could hear shopping carts being gathered, engines starting, the occasional truck backing up somewhere behind the building. It wasn't a beautiful place, but it was mine. The first couple of weeks felt good in a way I hadn't expected. Quiet, predictable. I could leave dishes in the sink and no one cared. I was 24 when I moved into my first apartment alone. It was in a small college town in upstate New York, about 10 minutes from campus. Not student housing, just an old brick building tucked behind a pharmacy and a laundromat. 3 floors, narrow hallways, heavy fire doors that always closed too hard. My unit was on the 3rd floor at the very end. 1 bedroom, old hardwood floors, radiator heat. The windows looked out over the parking lot and the back of a grocery store. At night, I could hear shopping carts being gathered, engines starting, the occasional truck backing up somewhere behind the building. It wasn't a beautiful place, but it was mine. The first couple of weeks felt good in a way I hadn't expected. Quiet, predictable. I could leave dishes in the sink and no one cared. I could come home late, make coffee at midnight, sit on the floor and read if I wanted. The building had its own sounds, but after a while they became familiar. The radiator ticking as it cooled, water moving through pipes, a neighbor walking down the hallway, doors opening and shutting somewhere below. Once you live somewhere long enough, your brain starts sorting those sounds without you noticing. You stop hearing them.
That's why I noticed the one that didn't belong. It was just after 11 on a Thursday. I had fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on. I woke up because the screen had gone dark and the room was suddenly colder. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I was listening. There was a sound in the hallway outside my apartment. Soft, slow. Footsteps. Not unusual by themselves. People came and went late sometimes. What made me sit up was that they stopped outside my door. I remember looking at the front entrance from where I was lying on the couch. Nothing moved under it. No shadow, no sound. I waited. Maybe someone was checking their phone. Maybe they had the wrong apartment. That happens. Then I heard one more step. Not away from the door. Closer. Like someone had shifted their weight directly in front of it. I sat there longer than I should have. Then I got up quietly and walked toward the door. I didn't look through the peephole right away. For some reason, I didn't want whoever was outside to hear me. That thought felt irrational the second it crossed my mind. Still, I moved slowly. When I finally looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. Just the yellow overhead light and the long stretch of carpet leading toward the stairwell. No one. I stood there for another few seconds listening. Nothing. I locked the deadbolt, even though it was already locked, then went back to bed. I told myself I had probably woken up halfway through someone walking past. That made sense. By morning, it barely bothered me. The second time happened 3 nights later. I came home late from work. It was close to midnight. The parking lot was almost empty, and there was that cold November wind that makes everything sound farther away than it is. I climbed the stairs, unlocked my apartment, stepped inside, and immediately stopped. My kitchen light was on. Not bright enough to spill all the way into the living room, but enough that I noticed it before I even shut the door. I was certain I hadn't left it on. I stood there trying to remember. Maybe I had. Maybe I was tired. That had become my explanation for almost everything. I went inside. The apartment looked normal. Backpack on the chair, mail on the counter, the half-read book beside the couch. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed. I turned off the kitchen light and stood there for a moment in the dark. That was when I heard it. A soft tap from the bedroom. Not loud, not sharp, just one small sound. I waited. Another one. It sounded almost delicate, like something touching glass. I told myself it was probably the window. The old frames rattled when the wind picked up. I walked down the short hallway. The bedroom was dark except for the parking lot lights outside. The curtains were half open, and on the windowsill, my keys were laying there. I stopped. I always kept my keys in the ceramic dish by the front door. Always. I stared at them for a second, trying to understand what I was looking at. Maybe I put them there that morning. Maybe I had come into the bedroom before work and forgotten. I kept trying to force that memory into place, but it wouldn't come. The tap happened again. This time I realized what it was. The metal key ring barely moving against the glass. I stepped closer. The window was shut. No draft, no movement in the curtains, and yet the keys were shifting slightly. Just enough to touch the pane. I picked them up. They were cold, colder than the room. I don't know why that detail stayed with me, but it did. That night, I slept with the hallway light on. After that, I started noticing the hallway more. The third floor had only 3 units, mine at the end, one across from the stairwell, one near the fire exit. Most nights it was quiet. Too quiet.
Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I would sometimes wake up and hear someone walking slowly past my door. Never hurried, never heavy, just measured steps. 1, 2, 3, then nothing. The first few times I told myself it was another tenant, but eventually I realized something. I never heard a door open, never heard stairs, just the footsteps, and then silence. That was when the apartment started to feel different. It's hard to explain. The rooms didn't change. The couch was still where it had always been. The same books, same dishes, same coat hanging by the door. But it stopped feeling like a place I returned to. It started feeling like a place I entered, like something in it noticed when I came home. One Friday evening, I decided I was being ridiculous. I needed something ordinary, something practical. Before leaving for dinner with a friend, I did something small. I put one dining chair slightly away from the table. Not much, maybe 4 inches. Just enough that I would know. I even looked at it for a second before leaving. I remember thinking how stupid it felt. I got home around 11:30, unlocked the door, turned on the light. The chair was pushed in, perfectly straight. I didn't move right away. I just stood there with my keys still in my hand. There had to be an explanation. Maybe I remembered it wrong. Maybe I thought I had moved it. I walked over and pulled it back out, exactly 4 inches. Then I went to bed. At around 2 in the morning, I woke up again. Not from sound, just awake. The apartment was completely still. Then I heard breathing, very faint. I froze. At first I thought it was mine, but when I held my breath, it didn't stop. It was somewhere beyond the bedroom door, soft, slow. I sat up slowly, every part of me suddenly alert. The breathing continued for maybe 5 seconds. Then it was gone. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound.
I stayed in bed for a long time, my eyes fixed on the bedroom doorway. Nothing moved. Eventually, I got up. I don't know why, maybe because not knowing felt worse. The hallway outside the bedroom was empty, the living room dark, the kitchen dark, everything exactly where it should be. Then I looked toward the front door. The deadbolt was locked, but the chain had been slid halfway across, not latched, just resting there. I never used the chain, not once. I stood there staring at it until I felt cold. The next morning, I knocked on the apartment across the hall. An older woman lived there. I'd only spoken to her twice. I asked if she ever heard footsteps at night. She looked at me for a second. Then she said, "Near your door?" I remember feeling something drop in my stomach. I asked what she meant. She shrugged, said sometimes she heard someone stop there. She thought it was me. Then she added something I still remember exactly. She said, "I always wait until it walks away." I moved out in February. Officially, it was because I found something closer to work. That was true, just not the whole truth. A month later, I went back because I'd accidentally shipped a package there. The new tenant was a guy around my age. He handed me the box, smiled, and said the place was nice, but weirdly noisy at night. I asked what kind of noise. He laughed a little. "Sounds like somebody standing outside the door sometimes." I didn't say anything. I just thanked him and left. Sometimes I still think about that hallway, the yellow light, the narrow carpet, the silence that never felt empty. And every now and then, usually late at night, I'll wake up in a perfectly quiet room and feel that old instinct again, the strange certainty that if I opened the door, someone might already be there.
The first time it happened, it didn't feel important. It was a Sunday in late November, around 8:30 at night. My parents had driven 2 hours north to visit my aunt after she got out of the hospital, and I stayed home because I had work early the next morning. I was 22 then, still living at home in a quiet suburb outside Columbus. It wasn't unusual to have the house to myself. If anything, I liked it. The house always felt different when nobody else was there. Not empty exactly, just quieter in a way that made every sound easier to notice. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the heater kicking on, a car passing outside every few minutes, the little ticking noise the hallway clock made when everything else went still. I made pasta, watched half a basketball game, and left my bowl in the sink because I told myself I'd wash it later. Around 10, I turned off the TV. That was when the house changed. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. When the television went dark, the living room reflected back at me in the black screen, the lamp by the couch, the tree outside the front window, the hallway leading toward the bedrooms. I stood up and stretched, and for a second I thought I saw movement near the kitchen, just a shift in shadow. I turned immediately. Nothing. I remember standing there for a moment, looking toward the kitchen doorway. The light above the stove was still on. My bowl sat in the sink. The back door was closed. Everything looked normal. I told myself it was just a screen reflection. That made sense. I locked the front door, checked the back door, turned off the kitchen light, and went upstairs. My room was at the end of the hall, across from the bathroom. My parents' room was farther down, near the stairs. I changed clothes, plugged in my phone, and got into bed. For a while, I scrolled through messages, half paying attention. Then I turned off the lamp. The house settled around me. A pipe clicked in the wall. The heat came on. Then, quiet. I must have started drifting off because the next thing I remember was opening my eyes and not knowing why. My room was dark, except for a stripe of light under the door. I stared at it for a second, trying to understand what felt wrong. Then I remembered I had turned the hallway light off. I was sure of it. I sat up a little. There was no sound outside. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. I waited, thinking maybe I was remembering wrong. Maybe I left it on without noticing. That happens. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty. The light was on. Everything looked ordinary. The framed family photos, the beige carpet, the bathroom door half closed. I stepped out and looked toward the stairs. Dark downstairs. No movement. I almost turned the light off and went back to bed. Then I noticed the bathroom door. It was open now, only a little wider, maybe an inch. That sounds ridiculous now, but I remember it clearly because I had noticed it half closed before. I stood there staring at it. Then I told myself I was being stupid. Old houses shift, doors move. I walked over and pushed it open. The bathroom was empty. Sink, mirror, towels, nothing unusual. I turned off the hallway light and went back into my room, but I didn't close the door all the way. I'm not sure why. I just didn't want to. For the next 20 minutes, I lay there listening. At some point, I started to
I was alone in my own house, acting like a nervous kid. That thought finally settled me down. Then I heard it, a soft sound downstairs. Not loud enough to be obvious, just a small contact, like wood against wood. I held my breath. Nothing. Then again, a little clearer, from the kitchen. I sat up. My first thought was the bowl in the sink. Maybe it shifted. Maybe water dripped. There had to be an explanation. I got out of bed again, slower this time. The hallway felt colder. At the top of the stairs, I stopped. The entire first floor was dark. The living room windows reflected faint streetlight back into the house, just enough to outline furniture. I listened. Nothing. Then I went down one step, then another. The stairs creaked under me. By the time I reached the bottom, I could see into the kitchen, and that's when I stopped. The cabinet under the sink was open, not wide, just enough to notice. I stood there trying to remember if I had opened it earlier, maybe for trash bags. Maybe I forgot to close it. That felt reasonable. I walked toward it, and then I noticed something else. My bowl was no longer in the sink. It was on the counter, a few inches from the edge. I stared at it for a long moment. That made no sense. I was certain I had left it in the sink, not mostly sure, certain. I remember because I had seen it when I turned off the kitchen light. My mouth had gone dry. I stepped closer. The bowl was still damp underneath. There was a faint ring of water on the counter. For a second, I honestly thought maybe I had done it without remembering. That frightened me more than anything else. I checked the back door, locked. I checked the windows, all shut. The whole house felt strangely unfamiliar then. Same kitchen, same counters, same magnets on the refrigerator, but it felt like I was standing in a place that had shifted slightly when I wasn't looking. I pushed the cabinet closed, put the bowl back in the sink, turned on every light downstairs. Then I checked every room: dining room, living room, laundry room, coat closet. Nothing. No one. Eventually, I went back upstairs, but I left every light on. I didn't sleep much. Every time the house made a sound, I listened for another one. Morning made everything easier. Sunlight usually does. The kitchen looked smaller, normal, almost harmless. I actually felt relieved enough to laugh at myself. Then I saw the back door. The deadbolt was locked, but the chain above it was hanging loose. My parents always used the chain, always. I never did. I stood there staring at it, trying to remember if maybe I had touched it the night before, maybe while checking the lock. Maybe I moved it without thinking. I wanted that to be true. I went to work and didn't think much about it for the rest of the day. That evening, my parents came home. I almost didn't mention anything, but while we were eating dinner, I asked my mom if she had come back for something the night before. She looked confused. She said no. Then she asked why. I told her about the hallway light, the bowl, the cabinet. She listened quietly. Then she said something I still think about. She asked, "Did you hear someone walking around upstairs?" I remember putting my fork down. I said no. She didn't answer right away. Then she told me that 3 nights before they left, she woke up around 2 in the morning and heard footsteps in the hallway outside their room. She thought it was me getting water, but when she checked, my door was closed and I was asleep. We both sat there for a second. My dad laughed and said old houses make bold noises, and maybe he was right. That was years ago. Nothing dramatic ever happened after that. No broken locks, no missing things, no figure in the hallway. But even now, when I'm home alone somewhere, there's one thing I still do without thinking. Before I go upstairs, I look at the kitchen sink, just to make sure everything is where I left it. Because sometimes what stays with you isn't what you saw. It's realizing that for a little while, you may not have been alone.